Hi-ho, Kermit the Frog here, speaking to you from out of the trenches, where I sit here in my chair of wisdom and answer all your questions about the First World War. Lillian Garmaniak writes, "Hi Indian team, I was wondering if hunting could take place on the front during the war. I suspect that the soldier in the first line trenches wasn't really able to do anything else than waiting. But what about the rear? As civilians were evacuated, the front located on previous agricultural land or woods that could harbor a large variety of wild animals, and the ordinary meal was poor in meat. Were soldiers authorized to hunt, or was the practice organized by some specialized foraging unit? Thanks a lot, and keep up the good work." Food and nutrition was very important in keeping the soldiers healthy and happy, of course. Take the British. The government aimed at feeding the soldiers 4,000 calories a day. At the start of the war, a British soldier would receive rations of 280 grams of meat a day. By 1916, rations were halved. At the end of the war, meat was only available once in every 9 days for some units. For the German soldiers that suffered under the blockade, the food situation at the end of the war was abysmal. The mood in the canteens on the Western Front by 1918 was terrible, as less and less meat was put on the table. One advantage of the war in the vast areas of the Eastern Front was that they could regularly send out hunting parties, but the Western Front offered no such opportunities. It became so bad that once meat was included in the rations, right? You got meat one day, then everybody knew that a really tough day of fighting was ahead of them. At the front, the soldiers could hunt pretty much only for birds, which they did. There are known examples of soldiers hunting for partridges and pheasants or fishing, but this was seen more of a sport and leisure activity, but it did also serve to supplement their rations, of course. Soldiers were, in fact, quite creative in supplementing their rations. Some kept poultry for meat and eggs, and the Gloucestershire Regiment, is said to have kept a trench cow to supply fresh milk. In more quiet areas, it would have also been possible to have, a small patch of your own grown vegetables. We did talk about how the Bulgarian soldiers on the Macedonian front had their own operating farms, and they had a pretty well thought out supply system. Rolf Postma writes, "Dear Indian gang," that's you guys too, gang. Yay. Ralph Postma was wondering what happened to colonial rule and trade in the colonies of the neutral Netherlands. Did Germany completely cut off the flow of goods and people between the Netherlands and the colonies? Did the colonies have trade between them to compensate for the unreachable parent country? Was Dutch rule maintained, or were there rebellions that wanted to make use of the absence of direct Dutch control? Thanks, and keep up the good work. Okay, it was not at all in Germany's interest to cut off trade and transports between the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies. Before the war, a quarter of Germany's imported goods came into Germany through the Netherlands. During the war, Germany would rely heavily on trade with the Netherlands. As the German general Helmut von Moltke put it, the Netherlands was the windpipe through which Germany could breathe, right? A bigger threat to the Dutch free trade and to the trade between the Netherlands and its colonies was the Allied naval blockade. Its objective was to prevent important goods from reaching Germany, even though, according to international law, neutral countries had the right to trade in non-military goods with neutrals and belligerents alike. The British wanted to prevent Dutch supplies from reaching Germany. This, of course, was a huge threat to both the Dutch trade and the Dutch neutrality. If the Dutch ever promised to withhold from trading with Germany, that would in fact compromise Dutch neutrality. So to solve this dilemma, Dutch private entrepreneurs and private bankers invented the Overseas Trust Company, the NOT. Anyone who wanted to bring goods into the Netherlands had to sign a contract with them to not sell certain goods to the Central Powers. The Allies found this solution sufficient and allowed NOT goods to pass the blockade. In exchange for this promise, the Allies allowed the NOT to sell luxury goods from the Dutch East Indies to Germany. With this trade in coffee, tea, tobacco, the companies that founded the NOT made huge profits. And just another nerd wants to know, just another nerd, huh? Come on, don't sell yourself short. You're a special nerd. A question for Out of the Trenches. Hello, Indian crew. Thank you for an amazing show. I was reading up about the Dreyfus Affair, and it was mentioned he later served in World War I, and he got the Legion of Honor for his fighting in the Chemin des Dames, and was wondering, how did the soldiers react to serving with such a notorious figure? And if possible, was there any documentation of him? Thank you so much, and please continue the awesome work. Okay, yes. The Dreyfus Affair. Okay, for those of you who don't know about the Dreyfus Affair, let me refresh your minds about what exactly that was. This was a case that became a symbol of anti-Semitism around the turn of the century. The French Alsatian Jewish artillery officer, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, was convicted of treason and espionage in December 1894. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life on Devil's Island in French Guiana. 2 years later, George Picquart, not Picard, Picquart, head of French counter-espionage, discovered that the spy had actually been Major Ferdinand Esterhazy. But high-ranking army officials then suppressed the new evidence, and Esterhazy was acquitted. A big pro-Dreyfus movement emerged in public life and the newspapers, including people like writer Émile Zola. Georges Clemenceau was also in the pro-Dreyfus camp, the guy who is now Prime Minister of France. Well, Prime Minister now 100 years ago. The pro- and anti-Dreyfus camps dominated the public debate for years and really split the French intellectual community. A new trial in 1899 convicted Dreyfus again, but he was pardoned. In 1906, he was exonerated and reinstated in the army as a major. He was made a Knight of the Legion of Honor and became a squadron leader, but the impossibility of achieving the rank of general officer caused him to retire in 1907. He returned at age 55 when the war began. He served at the staff office of the Paris camp and later as an officer in the artillery depot of the 168th Division of the 20th Corps. Let's see, he saw action during the Nivelle Offensive at Verdun and the Battle of Chemin des Dames as the commander of an artillery battery. Dreyfus was promoted to lieutenant colonel of the reserves in the fall of 1918 and was made an officer in the Legion of Honor by Clemenceau in July 1919. Reportedly, though, he thought of himself as an officer just like any other officer. And here is one more question. Hey, Indy, what was the extent of private purchase in the war? I know that officers could bring pistols from home, but what about riflemen and infantry? Did it last till the end of the war? How much could a soldier change his equipment? Great show, and I can't wait for the spring offensive episodes. Oh, it's going to be real soon, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, this is probably coming out long after that. Okay. So it's probably all over by now. Okay, well anyway, I'll answer your question. Sorry, what day is today? Today's March 14th when I'm answering your question, so they haven't started yet, right? The regular soldiers could not make changes to their uniform or equipment at all, and it was strictly forbidden to make modifications. It is true that officers, the higher they rose through the ranks, could buy their own trench coats, sidearms, watches, and so forth, but even they had to conform to standards. A regular soldier could keep souvenirs from the battlefield and carry personal items like photographs or letters or food with him, like if his family sent him chocolate or extra rations. But any modifications to equipment or weapons that went further than, say, sharpening the spade or carrying an extra trench knife, that was often severely punished. Some officers were a bit more relaxed with additional undergarments or footwear, but most of the time the soldiers had to wear what the Army Code provided. Exceptions were, of course, irregular forces or armies that could not provide a standard. Well, that is all for today, but you can check out our special episode about Georges Clemenceau right here. And you can also follow us on Twitter, and you can like us on Facebook, and you can like me in your dreams and thoughts and prayers. And I'll see you next time.